At a family meeting, my parents casually mentioned they would use my inheritance to pay off my sister's debts. I just let them talk. They had no idea I'd already transferred all assets to a trust fund they couldn't touch. Zero access granted. My name is Michael. I'm 36 years old, and I never thought I'd have to protect my inheritance from my own family. When my grandfather Edward died, he left me substantial assets. At our family meeting last month, my parents casually announced they'd use it all to bail out my sister's gambling debts. They had no idea I'd already transferred everything to a trust fund they couldn't touch. Their faces when I told them? Priceless. The text from my father came on a Tuesday afternoon while I was finishing up with a client at my financial advisory firm in downtown Chicago. Family meeting this weekend. Important matters to discuss. Be at the house by 3 p.m. Saturday. No further explanation. No context. Just the usual Robert Brooks command performance. I felt that familiar knot form in my stomach. In our family, important meetings had always been code for Brianna needs something and you need to help. My younger sister had been the golden child since childhood, with my parents rushing to solve every problem she encountered, while I was expected to be the responsible, self-sufficient one who would ultimately clean up everyone's messes. Another family emergency? Victor asked, leaning against my office door frame. My best friend since college, and now my business partner, he could read my expressions better than anyone. Apparently, I sighed, showing him the text. Wanna bet it's about Brianna again? No bet, he laughed dryly. What is it this time? Another failed business venture? Divorce number 3? Tax problems? I rubbed my temples, feeling a headache forming. I don't know, but it's important enough for a formal summons. What made this timing particularly suspicious was that it had been 18 months since my grandfather Edward had passed away. Grandpa Edward had been my rock, the one person in the family who truly understood me. While my parents doted on Brianna, he had taken me under his wing, teaching me about financial independence and self-respect. His estate was substantial, a beautiful historic property in Vermont, a diverse investment portfolio he'd built over decades, and a collection of family heirlooms, including a watch collection that dated back generations. The inheritance process had been slow, partly due to the complexity of his estate and partly because of some unusual stipulations in his will. But the final distributions were scheduled for next month, and suddenly my parents wanted an important family meeting. You know, Victor said carefully, I've been hearing some things about Brianna through the grapevine. Cassandra at the investment firm mentioned seeing her at the Riverfront Casino several times last month. That caught my attention. Brianna's gambling again? Victor nodded. Apparently, she's been there almost every night, and not at the small stakes tables. A chill ran through me. Brianna had struggled with gambling in her 20s, burning through her trust fund before our parents bailed her out. She'd supposedly gotten it under control, but addiction rarely just disappears. That evening, instead of preparing for my client meetings the next day, I found myself digging through old family financial documents. As both a financial advisor and the only family member with any actual financial sense, I had copies of most important family papers. Grandpa Edward had insisted on it. What I discovered in those financial records changed everything. By the time I walked into that family meeting, I was 10 steps ahead of their plan to rob me blind. Growing up in the Brooks household meant understanding your role early. Mine was to be the responsible, level-headed son who never caused trouble. Brianna, 2 years younger, was the charming daughter who could do no wrong. When I got straight A's, my report card would be acknowledged with a nod. When Brianna managed to get C's instead of D's, there would be celebrations and rewards. You don't need the praise, Michael, my father would say. You're naturally good at school. Brianna has to work harder. This logic extended to everything. I didn't need attention because I was self-sufficient. Brianna needed constant support because she struggled. My salvation came in the form of my grandfather Edward, my mother's father. A widower who had managed his late wife's family textile business for 20 years after her death, he recognized something in me that my parents overlooked. You have a head for numbers and a strength they don't see, he told me during one of our weekend visits when I was 12. They're so busy looking at what Brianna needs that they don't see what you have to offer. Grandpa Edward became my mentor. While my parents took Brianna to shopping trips and movies, he took me to his investment advisor's office and taught me how to read financial statements. When I turned 16, he helped me open my first investment account with money I'd earned tutoring classmates. Financial independence is freedom, he would say. Learn to manage money, and you'll never be at anyone's mercy. I took his lessons to heart, majoring in finance at Northwestern and going on to get my MBA in financial advisor certifications. Meanwhile, Brianna dropped out of 3 different colleges before our parents finally stopped paying tuition. Instead, they funded a series of business ventures, a boutique that closed within 8 months, a social media consulting company that never consulted for a single viable client, and an online jewelry store that somehow lost 6 figures before folding. After each failure, there would be a family meeting. My parents would explain how Brianna just needed one more chance and how families should support each other. These meetings inevitably ended with my parents restructuring family assets or taking out loans against their property to bail Brianna out. Your sister has big dreams, my mother Linda would say defensively when I questioned these decisions. She's just had bad luck. It wasn't luck, it was incompetence combined with entitlement. Brianna expected success without work and rescue without consequences. The pattern continued into our 30s. I built a successful financial advisory practice, got married to Sarah, a marketing director who saw through my family's dynamics immediately, and eventually divorced when our careers pulled us in different directions. Through it all, I maintained my financial independence, just as Grandpa Edward had taught me. Brianna, meanwhile, cycled through jobs, relationships, and money as if they were disposable. By 34, she had 2 failed marriages, multiple credit card defaults, and a reputation in Chicago business circles as someone to avoid partnering with. When Grandpa Edward became ill with cancer 3 years ago, I was the one who moved him into my guest room and coordinated his care. My parents visited occasionally, and Brianna showed up exactly twice, both times asking him for money while he was on his deathbed. During one of his final lucid days, Grandpa Edward held my hand and told me something I would never forget. "I've arranged things to protect you, Michael," he whispered, his once strong voice now frail. "The bulk of my estate will come to you. Not because I love you more, but because you're the only one who understands its value beyond just money." He made me promise to use the inheritance thoughtfully, to maintain the Vermont property where 4 generations of our family had spent summers, to continue the charitable foundation he'd established, and to preserve the family heirlooms for future generations. "Your parents won't understand my decision," he warned. "They'll try to convince you to share everything equally, regardless of the consequences. Stand firm." After he passed, the initial reading of the will had gone exactly as he predicted. My parents were shocked to learn that while they received some specific bequests and Brianna got a modest trust that could only be accessed for education or starting a legitimate business with trustee approval, I was the primary beneficiary. "There must be some mistake," my father had said to Calvin Spencer, Grandpa's attorney of 30 years. "Edward wouldn't have wanted to create division in the family like this." "Mr. Brooks, I assure you, Edward was quite clear about his wishes," Calvin had replied firmly. He revised this will 3 times in his final year to ensure it precisely reflected his intentions. In the 18 months since, there had been constant pressure. Subtle comments at family dinners about what Grandpa would have wanted. Emails with links to articles about siblings sharing inheritances equally. Pointed questions about when the estate would be settled. I had maintained my boundaries politely but firmly, honoring my promise to Grandpa Edward. The Vermont property was being restored according to historical preservation standards. The investment portfolio remained intact, with specified portions of earnings going to the foundation. The family heirlooms were being properly catalogued and insured. Sarah had called me just last week, one of our occasional check-in conversations since the divorce. "How's the inheritance situation?" she'd asked. "Still getting pressure from the vultures?" "Sarah," I'd admonished, though I couldn't help laughing. "They're still my family." "Family doesn't try to separate you from what's rightfully yours," she'd replied. "Your grandfather knew exactly what he was doing. He was protecting his legacy from their mismanagement." After hanging up, I'd reflected on how right both Sarah and Grandpa had been. Just last month, I'd discovered that my parents had somehow accessed information about the estate accounts that they shouldn't have had. Small inconsistencies in statements, questions they asked that revealed knowledge they shouldn't possess. Something wasn't right, and with the family meeting looming, I needed to find out what was really going on. The day after receiving my father's text, I called Calvin Spencer's office and scheduled an urgent appointment. Calvin had been my grandfather's attorney for decades and was serving as the executor of his estate. If anyone knew what was happening behind the scenes, it would be him. His office was in one of Chicago's historic buildings, all polished wood and leather furniture that had been there since the firm was founded in the 1890s. Calvin, now in his 70s with silver hair and sharp blue eyes, welcomed me with a concerned expression. "Michael, I was actually about to call you," he said after his secretary had brought us coffee. "There have been some unusual inquiries about your grandfather's estate." "From my parents?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. He nodded. "Your father has requested copies of all account statements and property deeds. He claimed you had asked him to review everything before final distribution." "Which I absolutely did not," I clarified. "I assumed as much, which is why I didn't provide the documents." Calvin opened a folder on his desk. "However, I've noticed some concerning account activity that I wanted to discuss with you." He showed me records indicating that someone had attempted to access the investment accounts using the secondary password that had been established during Grandpa's illness. There were also inquiries to the Vermont Property Management Company about appraisal values and potential selling procedures. "I don't understand," I said, though a sinking feeling in my stomach suggested I did. "Why would anyone be looking into selling the property? Grandpa specifically wanted it kept in the family." Calvin looked uncomfortable. "Your father mentioned something about family financial restructuring that would be more beneficial given current circumstances. He implied this was being discussed with all parties." "This is the first I'm hearing of it," I said, my voice tight. "What current circumstances is he referring to?" Calvin hesitated. "It's not my place to speculate, but he did mention significant family obligations that needed to be addressed before the inheritance distribution." "Brianna," I said flatly. "This is about Brianna." Calvin didn't confirm or deny, maintaining his professional discretion, but his expression told me everything. I thanked him for his vigilance and asked him to continue preventing unauthorized access to the estate. Then I made my next stop, the office of Dennis Watkins, the family accountant who had managed both my parents' and Brianna's finances for years. Dennis was less discreet than Calvin after I pressed him about recent activities. "Look, I'm caught in the middle here," he said nervously, straightening papers on his desk. "Your parents asked me not to discuss this with you until after your family meeting." Dennis, these are my grandfather's assets we're talking about. I have a right to know if something's going on. He sighed heavily. Brianna's in trouble, Michael. Serious trouble. Gambling debts, I guessed. Dennis looked surprised. You knew? I suspected. How much? Over $300,000 to some very unpleasant creditors. He lowered his voice. People who don't just send collection notices, if you understand what I mean. The amount staggered me. And let me guess, my parents want to use my inheritance to bail her out. Again. Dennis's uncomfortable expression confirmed it. They've asked me to prepare financial projections for using the most liquid assets from the estate to clear her debts immediately after distribution. Which assets exactly? He reluctantly showed me their plan: liquidate the investment portfolio, take a mortgage against the Vermont property, and sell the most valuable pieces of the watch collection. Essentially, they planned to dismantle everything Grandpa Edward had specifically wanted preserved. Have they done this before? Used family assets to pay off Brianna's debts without telling me? Dennis looked even more uncomfortable. Your parents refinanced their home twice to cover Brianna's previous gambling losses. And 3 years ago, they sold some of your grandmother's antique furniture collection that was supposed to be held in trust for both you and Brianna. That collection had been promised to us since childhood. I'd never received my portion and had assumed it was still in storage. After leaving Dennis's office, I went straight to my parents' house, knowing they'd be out at their weekly bridge game. I still had a key from when I would check on the place during their winter trips to Florida. What I was about to do wasn't strictly ethical, but I needed to know the truth. In my father's home office, I found folders labeled Family Trust Restructuring containing draft documents for a new family trust that would consolidate all of Edward's assets under my parents' control as trustees. Another folder held emails between my father and a different attorney, not Calvin, discussing how to challenge certain provisions of Grandpa's will if necessary. Most damning was an email exchange between my parents discussing their strategy. Michael will resist at first, but once we explain Brianna's situation, he'll come around. He always does, my mother had written. My father's response: if he doesn't, we can proceed with Plan B. The important thing is getting access to those assets before Brianna's creditors take more drastic action. Once everything's in the family trust, we can distribute as needed. There it was in black and white. They were planning to use emotional manipulation to get me to hand over my inheritance, and if that didn't work, they had a plan B that involved legal maneuvers to seize control. I photographed the crucial documents with my phone and carefully replaced everything exactly as I'd found it. As I drove home, I mentally cataloged what was at stake: the Vermont property that had been in our family for 4 generations, the stock portfolio worth nearly $2 million that Grandpa had built meticulously over decades, and the watch collection that included pieces from the 1890s that had been passed down through the men in our family. All of it would be liquidated to pay off Brianna's gambling debts if my parents had their way. And once those assets were gone, they would be gone forever. The family legacy Grandpa Edward had entrusted to me would disappear. By the time I reached my condo, hurt and betrayal had given way to cold determination. They thought I was the same passive son who would sacrifice everything for family harmony. They had no idea who they were dealing with now. The morning after discovering my parents' plan, I contacted Diana Roberts, a trust attorney I knew through professional circles. Diana specialized in asset protection and had a reputation for creative but impeccable legal strategies. Let me make sure I understand, Diana said after I explained the situation. Your grandfather left you these assets in his will. The estate is in final probate, and your parents are planning to pressure you into putting everything into a family trust they control so they can use it to pay your sister's gambling debts. That's exactly right, I confirmed. And they have a plan B that seems to involve challenging the will if I don't cooperate. Diana's expression hardened. They don't have legal grounds to challenge a properly executed will simply because they don't like the distribution. But they could potentially cause delays and complications, especially if they're willing to make false claims. What are my options? I asked. The strongest approach would be creating an irrevocable trust before they can act, she explained. Once assets are in an irrevocable trust with you as both grantor and beneficiary, they're protected from exactly this kind of family pressure. Your parents would have no legal means to access them. How quickly can we set that up? Diana checked her calendar. I can have the documentation ready by tomorrow afternoon, but we'll need to move fast to transfer the assets before your family meeting. When is it scheduled? Saturday at 3. That gives us 3 days. It's tight, but doable. What followed was a whirlwind of activity. Diana drafted the trust documents while I worked with Calvin to prepare for the asset transfers. By Friday afternoon, the investment accounts had been successfully transferred to the trust. Calvin had expedited the property deed filing for the Vermont house. The final step was retrieving the watch collection from the safety deposit box at my parents' bank. As the bank manager led me to the vault, my heart pounded. The safety deposit box contained not just watches, but also small family heirlooms that Grandpa Edward had specifically wanted me to have: his father's silver pocket watch, the cufflinks that had belonged to his grandfather, and a collection of handwritten business correspondence dating back to the 1880s. By Friday evening, I met with both Calvin and Diana to verify that all assets were secure in the irrevocable trust. The timing had been perfect. Everything was officially transferred less than 24 hours before the family meeting. Your grandfather would be proud, Calvin said, a rare smile crossing his usually formal features. He always said you had a backbone of steel when it mattered. What should I expect tomorrow? I asked them both. They'll be shocked, then angry, Diana predicted. They might threaten legal action, but there's nothing they can actually do. The trust is ironclad. Just remember, Calvin advised, keep your emotions in check no matter what they say. The moment this becomes about family feelings rather than legal rights, they'll try to manipulate you. That night, I barely slept, rehearsing what I would say and how I would respond to their inevitable arguments. By morning, I felt calm but alert, like a chess player who had anticipated his opponent's moves several turns in advance. The heavy oak door of my childhood home swung open before I could even ring the bell. My mother stood there in her navy cardigan and pearls, the picture of suburban maternal perfection. "Michael, finally. Everyone's waiting in the living room," she said, her voice carrying that artificial cheerfulness she used when orchestrating one of her scenarios. The living room was arranged like a stage set. My father occupied his usual leather armchair, reading glasses perched on his nose as he reviewed some documents. Brianna slouched on the sofa, her expression a mix of anxiety and entitlement. She barely looked up when I entered. After a few minutes of my mother's forced small talk about neighborhood gossip and the weather, my father cleared his throat, the traditional signal that the real meeting was about to begin. "Michael, we've asked you here today to discuss an important family matter," he began, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he'd used throughout my childhood. "As you know, family has always been our highest priority in this house." I nodded but said nothing, allowing him to continue. "We've faced challenges before, and we've always overcome them by supporting each other," he continued, glancing at my mother, who nodded encouragingly. "That's what families do. They stand together during difficult times." "Robert, just tell him," my mother interjected with feigned impatience. "Michael understands family loyalty." My father adjusted his glasses. "Your sister has experienced some financial setbacks recently." Brianna shifted uncomfortably on the sofa but remained silent. "The nature of these setbacks isn't important," my father continued. "What matters is finding a solution that works for everyone." "I think the nature of the setbacks is very important," I said quietly. My mother shot me a warning look before jumping in. "Brianna has had some gambling issues resurface. But she's getting help now, aren't you, Brianna?" Brianna nodded without making eye contact. "Yeah, I'm going to meetings and stuff." "The immediate concern," my father pressed on, "is addressing certain financial obligations that have become rather urgent." "You mean her gambling debts?" I stated flatly. My father frowned at my directness. "As I was saying, with your grandfather's estate finally being distributed next month, we've worked out an arrangement that makes the most sense for the family as a whole." He slid a folder across the coffee table toward me. "We're establishing a new family trust that will consolidate all of Edward's assets. Your mother and I will serve as trustees, ensuring everything is managed properly for everyone's benefit. The first priority," my mother added smoothly, "would be resolving Brianna's current situation. But ultimately, everything would still be family property. It's what your grandfather would have wanted." I didn't touch the folder. "Is it?" My father continued as if I hadn't spoken. "Calvin Spencer has been less than cooperative with our requests, which has been disappointing. But our attorney assures us this new arrangement is legally sound. We just need your signature on these documents." He pulled out a pen and held it out to me expectantly. The silence stretched as I made no move to take it. Brianna finally looked up, her expression darkening. "Just sign the papers, Michael. Don't make this a bigger deal than it needs to be." Still, I said nothing. "Perhaps you don't understand the severity of the situation," my mother said, her voice taking on an edge. "Brianna owes some very dangerous people. This isn't just about money." "How much?" I asked. My parents exchanged glances. $327,000, my father finally admitted. "Plus another $80,000 to the IRS, my mother added reluctantly. "And the loan from Uncle Frank," Brianna muttered. "So over $400,000 in total," I summarized. "Which you plan to pay using my inheritance." "The family's assets," my father corrected sharply. "Edward's estate belongs to the family." "Actually, it doesn't," I replied calmly. "Grandpa Edward was very specific about his wishes. The Vermont property is to be preserved for future generations. The investment portfolio is to continue funding his foundation. The family heirlooms are to be protected, not sold." Those were general sentiments, not legal requirements, my mother dismissed. "The will gives you technical ownership, but Edward always intended these assets to benefit the entire family." "And bailing out Brianna's gambling debts benefits the family how, exactly?" I asked. Brianna slammed her hand on the coffee table. "For God's sake, Michael. They're trying to keep me from getting my legs broken or worse. Is that what you want? To see your sister hurt because you're being selfish?" "That's enough," my father said sharply, though it wasn't clear whether he was addressing me or Brianna. He took a deep breath and tried a different approach. "Michael, we understand this isn't ideal, but it's temporary. Once Brianna gets back on her feet, the trust will still hold all the assets for everyone's future benefit. We've helped you plenty over the years," my mother added, though we all knew that wasn't true. "Now it's your turn to help your sister." I looked at each of their faces, my father's stern confidence, my mother's manipulative concern, Brianna's desperate entitlement. They were so certain of how this would play out, so sure that I would eventually give in, as I always had before. "I think there's something you should know about grandfather's inheritance," I said finally. "As of yesterday," I continued, meeting each of their gazes steadily, "all assets from Grandpa Edward's estate have been transferred to an irrevocable trust with me as both grantor and beneficiary. The Vermont property, the investment portfolio, and all the family heirlooms are now legally protected. None of you can touch them. The silence that followed was absolute. My mother's mouth opened and closed without sound. My father's face flushed a dangerous shade of red. Brianna stared at me as if I'd suddenly started speaking a foreign language. That's not possible, my father finally said. The estate is still in probate. Final probate, I corrected. Calvin expedited the last distributions at my request, and Diana Roberts helped me establish the trust immediately afterward. Diana Roberts, my mother repeated. You went behind our backs to another attorney? Just like you went behind my back to another attorney to try to challenge Grandpa's will, I countered. Yes, I know about Plan B. My father's expression confirmed everything. You had no right to do this. I had every right, I replied. They're my assets to protect, and that's exactly what Grandpa Edward wanted me to do. Brianna suddenly sprang to her feet, her face contorted with rage. You selfish bastard. Do you have any idea what these people will do to me if I don't pay? Brianna. My mother gasped, though whether she was shocked by her language or the confirmation of the danger, I couldn't tell. You've always been like this, she continued, pacing now. Always thinking you're better than everyone. Always. Judging me. The perfect son with his perfect career who never needed help from anyone. That's not true, I said. I worked for everything I have. The difference is that I don't expect others to bail me out when I make bad decisions. My mother rose and came to sit beside me, taking my hand in hers. Her voice became soft, cajoling, the tone she had always used to get her way. Michael, darling, I understand you're upset that we didn't discuss this with you earlier. That was our mistake. But surely you can see that Brianna's life is potentially in danger. As a family, we need to protect each other. I gently but firmly removed my hand from hers. I agree that Brianna needs protection, from herself and from your enabling. This has to stop. You have no idea what you're talking about, my father interjected. Brianna has a disease. Addiction is an illness, not a choice. I know that, I replied. And the appropriate response to illness is treatment, not financial bailouts that allow the behavior to continue. We can fight this in court, my father threatened, his lawyer mode fully engaged now. You've violated the spirit of your grandfather's will. No, I've honored it explicitly, I corrected. And you're welcome to challenge the trust in court, but Diana assures me it's ironclad. All you'll accomplish is spending more money on legal fees that could be better used solving the actual problem. Brianna had moved to the window, her back to us, shoulders rigid with tension. Easy for you to say. You're not the one who'll be dealing with Vincent and his guys. Who exactly did you borrow from, Brianna? I asked. She turned, her expression a mix of defiance and fear. Does it matter? Money's money. It matters if they're loan sharks or worse, I replied. That's not just gambling, that's getting involved with criminals. Don't be so dramatic, my mother interjected. Brianna borrowed from some private lenders when the banks wouldn't help. It's not ideal, but it's not organized crime. The way she avoided my eyes told me she was lying. This isn't getting us anywhere, my father said, his tactical mind clearly searching for a new angle. Michael, the trust may be irrevocable, but as the beneficiary, you can still direct distributions. You can choose to help your sister without dismantling the entire structure. That's true, I acknowledged. But I won't be doing that. Then you're choosing to put property and money above your own sister's safety, my mother said, her voice hardening. I never thought you could be so cold. I'm choosing to end a destructive pattern, I corrected her. One that you and Dad have enabled for decades. Don't you dare blame us for this, my father said, his voice rising. We've done everything possible to help both our children succeed. No, I replied, standing up and gathering my documents. You've done everything possible to protect Brianna from consequences, which is very different from helping her succeed. I'm not going to participate in this cycle anymore. If you walk out that door, my mother said, her voice trembling with either genuine emotion or theatrical effect, you're turning your back on this family. I'm not turning your back on anyone, I replied. I'm just refusing to set myself on fire to keep everyone else warm. We'll contest the trust, my father called as I reached the doorway. We'll claim undue influence, mental incapacity on Edward's part, anything we can. You'll be tied up in court for years. I turned back. And how exactly will that help Brianna with her immediate debt problem? Because those private lenders don't typically wait for family court disputes to be resolved. That silenced him momentarily. This isn't over, Brianna said, her voice low and threatening. You think you're so smart, but you have no idea what you're doing. I looked at each of them one last time, these people who were supposed to be my support system but had instead tried to manipulate and use me throughout my life. I know exactly what I'm doing, I said quietly. For the first time, I'm honoring Grandpa Edward's wishes and my own boundaries at the same time. As I walked to my car, I could hear Brianna shouting obscenities from the doorway. My mother called my name repeatedly, her voice shifting from anger to pleading. My father remained silent, which was somehow more unsettling than their emotional outbursts. Once inside my car, the composure I had maintained throughout the confrontation finally cracked. My hands shook as I gripped the steering wheel, and tears blurred my vision. I had anticipated their reactions logically, but the emotional reality of standing against my entire family hit me with unexpected force. Some inheritances aren't stored in bank vaults or property deeds. The most valuable things my grandfather left me were his courage and self-respect, and those are things nobody could ever take away. Sometimes the greatest gift we can give others is to stop protecting them from the consequences of their own choices. 6 months later, I stood on the wide porch of the Vermont property, watching autumn leaves drift across the lawn. The restoration was nearly complete, and this weekend was my first stay since the work had been finished. Brianna had completed a 90-day residential treatment program and was now living in a transitional recovery house while attending daily GA meetings. She had secured a job at a local garden center, modest work compared to her previous business ventures, but steady and stress-free. Most importantly, she was taking responsibility for her recovery one day at a time. My parents had made changes too. They had sold their 2-large family home and moved to a comfortable condo. Their finances were still tight, but they were no longer drowning in debt. Our relationships remained fragile, with tense moments and old patterns that threatened to resurface. But there was also new honesty between us all. My parents had stopped pretending everything was perfect, and I had stopped expecting them to be different people. That evening, I hosted a small dinner at the house, my parents, Brianna, Sarah, Victor, and my uncle Thomas. It was the first time we had all been together since the confrontation 6 months ago. There were awkward moments and old tensions just beneath the surface, but there was also laughter and genuine conversation. As we sat around the dining table that had hosted Brooks' family gatherings for generations, I realized that this imperfect, complicated, evolving relationship was also part of my inheritance. Not just the property and assets Grandpa Edward had legally left me, but the family he had always hoped we could become. The most valuable inheritance isn't measured in dollars, it's measured in self-worth and the courage to protect what truly matters.